Do you remember the satisfying click of a floppy disk locking into place? The faint whirring as your computer read that 1.44 megabyte disk, and the suspense of waiting to see if your files would actually load? For anyone who used a PC in the 1980s or 90s, floppy disks were a familiar part of life. Those little square disks, often with a handwritten label and a sliding metal shutter, held our school papers, video games, and even the earliest digital photos. They were more than just tech. They were a cultural icon of the pre-internet age. Yet today, floppy disks have virtually vanished. The once mighty floppy, in all its forms, has gone the way of rotary phones and VCR tapes. How did a storage medium that was everywhere just a few decades ago end up as a tech relic? What went wrong, and what drove the floppy disk to extinction? In today's episode of Relic Rewinds, we'll rewind the clock to explore the rise of the floppy disk, its heyday as the king of portable storage, the factors that led to its downfall, and the legacy it leaves behind. Hint: you probably clicked its image today without even realizing it. But first, let's journey back to where the floppy era began. The story of the floppy disk starts in the late 1960s at an IBM lab in San Jose, California. IBM engineer Alan Shugart and his team were tasked with finding a better way to load software microcode into mainframe computers. The result was the world's first floppy disk, an 8-inch flexible magnetic disk inside a protective sleeve, introduced commercially in 1971. This 8-inch floppy could hold about 80 kilobytes of data, roughly the same as 3,000 punch cards, which was a big deal at the time. It wasn't long before businesses started using these disks to replace punch cards for data storage and transfer. Early floppy disks were read-only, mainly used by IBM to distribute software and updates. But by 1972, they evolved to allow reading and writing of data, opening the door to personal and business use. As computers got smaller and more common, so did the floppy. In 1976, a new mini floppy was introduced, the 5.25-inch disk. Companies like Shugart Associates, founded by Alan Shugart after leaving IBM, developed this smaller floppy to fit the first wave of home computers and word processors. These disks had a modest capacity, initially around 110 to 360 KB, but they were cheaper and more practical for desktop machines than the giant 8-inch format. By the late 1970s and early 80s, 5.25-inch floppies were everywhere. From the Apple II to the IBM PC, often stored in little plastic boxes in every office and classroom. The evolution didn't stop there. In 1982, Sony unveiled an even smaller floppy, the 3.5-inch diskette. Enclosed in a hard plastic shell, the 3.5-inch floppy was more durable and could store more data than its predecessors. Apple adopted this new 3.5-inch standard for the Macintosh in 1984, and other computer makers soon followed. For a while in the late 80s, computers would come with 2 floppy drives, one for your old 5.25-inch disks and one for the newer 3.5-inch disks, just so you could read all your files. By the end of the 1980s, the transition was largely complete. The 3.5-inch floppy disk had superseded the 5.25-inch disk as the standard format. The 3.5-inch micro floppy held 1.44 megabytes at high density, enough to store a few documents or a small program, and its sturdy casing protected it from dust and bending in ways the earlier floppies couldn't. The floppy disk had become the basic fuel of the PC revolution, making personal computing and data exchange accessible and portable. Little did anyone know, the floppy's golden age had a countdown on it from the very start. By the early 1990s, floppy disks were everywhere. It's hard to overstate how integral these little disks were to daily computing life. Every PC shipped with a floppy disk drive, often 2 in the 80s. And every computer user had a stack of floppies on hand for backups, software installs, or sharing files. Need to copy a document or a few photos? Put it on a floppy disk and hand it to a friend. This was the era of the original sneakernet, when carrying data physically was often the easiest way to transfer it. At its peak, the floppy disk was so ubiquitous that an estimated hundreds of millions of floppies were sold each year worldwide. Floppy disks also permeated the culture of the time. Remember those AOL trial disks that used to come in the mail? Or the shareware games and software that came on floppies tucked inside magazines? A floppy disk with a handwritten label, perhaps homework or Doom save files, was a common sight on desks and in school backpacks. In workplaces, floppies shuttled spreadsheets and documents between computers. They even showed up in Hollywood if you watch movies from the 80s or 90s. Anytime someone needed to dramatically save or steal data, it was often a floppy disk they pulled out. One memorable aspect of floppy culture was the ritual of large software installations. For instance, installing Windows 95 from floppies meant feeding the computer 13 separate disks in sequence, a tedious process that became a tech legend. A joking rumor even claimed Windows 95 got its name from needing 95 disks, which wasn't true, but it captures how we felt at the time. Floppies defined the limits of what early software could be. Developers often had to compress files or split programs across multiple disks to fit that 1.44 megabytes constraint. Despite these limitations, we look back on this era with great nostalgia. The floppy disk was a trusty companion, a symbol of tech progress that, at the time, felt cutting edge. It even earned a permanent spot in the iconography of computing. The universal save icon in software is still, to this day, represented by a little floppy disk image. That's right, an entire generation that has never used a floppy disk still clicks on its picture to save their work. Everything seemed to be going well for the floppy disk in the early 90s, but just as the floppy was reaching the height of its fame, storm clouds were on the horizon. Technology doesn't stand still for long, and the world of data storage was about to undergo a massive change. So, what went wrong for the floppy disk? In short, technology caught up with it, and then sprinted past it. The mid-90s brought a perfect storm of innovations that would rapidly make floppy disks look woefully inadequate. Let's unpack the downfall of this once dominant format and the cautionary lessons it offers. 1. Soaring data needs, stuck capacity. As we moved into the 1990s, files were getting bigger. Documents began to include high-resolution images. Software grew more complex, and new media like MP3 music and digital photos were on the horizon. The floppy disk's 1.44 megabytes capacity suddenly felt incredibly small. For perspective, a single modest photo from a digital camera in the early 2000s could easily be 2 to 3 megabytes, more than 2 floppies worth of data for one picture. And as mentioned, installing a new operating system or office suite could require a dozen or more disks. This growing inconvenience set the stage for a better solution. 2. The rise of the CD and optical media. The first nail in the floppy's coffin was the CD-ROM. By the mid-90s, compact disks, which could hold about 700 megabytes, became an affordable and common way to distribute software and media. One CD could replace hundreds of floppy disks worth of data. Games and programs that would have been impossible to distribute on floppies, or would come in dauntingly large floppy sets, could be neatly packaged on a single CD. In 1995, computers started shipping with CD-ROM drives as standard, and some systems even began to offer CDR and CDRW drives, so users could burn their own disks. Compared to the floppy, CDs were faster, more durable, no worry about magnetic fields or dust, and could hold about 486 times more data, truly a giant leap. It became clear that floppy disks' days as the primary software medium were numbered. 3. The internet and networking boom. Around the same time, the internet went mainstream. By the late 90s, people were emailing documents and using early file-sharing services. If you needed to get a text document or a couple of images to someone, you could send them over a modem instead of physically handing them a disk. For businesses, local networks meant files could be shared on servers, again reducing the need for floppies. The floppy disk's role as the go-to file transfer device was fading. It simply couldn't compete with the instant delivery of electronic networks, even slow dial-up ones. 4. Enter the USB flash drive. If the CD dealt floppies a body blow, the USB flash drive was the finishing punch. The first USB flash drives came out around 2000, offering a few megabytes of storage on a keychain-sized stick. It might not seem like much, but even an 8 megabytes flash drive was the equivalent of 5 or 6 floppies, and the capacities only grew from there. By the early 2000s, flash drives of 32 megabytes, 64 megabytes, and more became common, far outstripping what floppies could do. They were also rewritable thousands of times, extremely fast, and required no delicate drive mechanisms. You just plugged them into a USB port. Suddenly, carrying data in your pocket was easier than ever, and it didn't involve juggling disks or worrying about the infamous disk error, abort, retry, fail. Messages. An interesting subplot in the floppy's decline was the effort to prolong its life with higher capacity floppy-like products. In the mid-90s, Iomega introduced the zip drive, which was like a supercharged floppy system that stored 100 megabytes, later 250 megabytes, on proprietary disks. For a short time, zip disks became popular for folks who needed more space for backups and big files. However, the zip drive suffered its own problems, including an infamous hardware failure nicknamed the click of death, and arrived just as CDs and flash drives were taking off. In hindsight, zip disks and similar super floppies were a stopgap solution. The future belonged to solid-state flash memory and the emerging realm of cloud storage. 5. Failing to adapt, a cautionary tale. The decline of floppy disks teaches a broader lesson that's very relevant today. Innovate or become obsolete. The companies behind floppy technology didn't necessarily do anything wrong. After all, they kept improving floppy capacity modestly over the years, from 360 KB to 720 KB to 1.44 megabytes. Even experimental 2.88 megabytes floppies existed. But the leap in technology outside the floppy world was exponential. It's a classic case of disruptive innovation, a new solution, like the USB drive or internet-based storage, doesn't just improve on floppies, it redefines the problem, making physical media itself optional. When Apple released the iMac in 1998 with no floppy drive at all, it seemed radical, even foolish to some. How could a computer not have a floppy? But Apple's move proved prescient. They bet on CD-ROMs, USB ports, and the nascent internet. And they were right. Other PC makers followed and started phasing out floppy drives in the early 2000s. By 2003 or so, a new PC with a factory-installed floppy drive was a rarity. In 2011, Sony, one of the last major floppy disk manufacturers, stopped making floppies altogether, marking the official end of the floppy era. The floppy disk's fall from grace was swift. Around 1995, floppies were on top of the world. By 2005, they were essentially obsolete in everyday life. This transition holds a mirror to today's tech landscape, reminding us that even the most entrenched technology can disappear within a decade if something dramatically better comes along. It's a lesson in humility for tech companies and consumers alike. Never get too comfortable with the status quo, because innovation is always just around the corner. It's been over a decade since the floppy disk faded into history, but its legacy lingers in surprising ways. For one, as mentioned, the icon for save in software is still a little floppy disk. a quirky tribute to a technology many younger users have never physically seen. Floppy disks also live on in the hearts of retro tech enthusiasts and in pockets of industry. Fun fact: up until just a few years ago, some airplane and military systems were still using 3.5-inch or even 8-inch floppies to update equipment, simply because those old machines kept chugging along. There's even a tourist attraction of sorts in the last Blockbuster video store in Oregon. They sell novelty floppy disk merchandise, blending two nostalgia in one. For the rest of us, the floppy disk is a warm memory of a different time in computing. Just holding one can bring back the scratchy sound of a dial-up modem, the chunky look of old DOS interfaces, or the excitement of loading a new game that came on 6 disks. While we certainly don't miss the limited storage or the slow speeds, we remember the floppy fondly as a symbol of our digital youth. In a way, that little disk represents how far we've come, from 80 KB all the way to terabytes in our phones, and it's a reminder to appreciate how quickly technology evolves. The rise and fall of the floppy disk is more than just tech nostalgia. It's a story about innovation, adaptation, and remembering our roots. Today, when you click that save icon or transfer gigabytes to the cloud in seconds, take a moment to thank the humble floppy disk that got us here. It may be gone, but it's certainly not forgotten. Did you ever use floppy disks? Maybe you remember the frustration of a corrupted disk or the fun of decorating labels with stickers. Share your floppy disk memories in the comments. We'd love to hear those stories. And if you enjoyed this trip down memory lane, don't forget to subscribe to Relic Rewinds for more blasts from the past every week. After all, understanding yesterday's tech, flops and all, can give us a clearer perspective on today's innovations. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay curious.